The School of Social Work, Facundo Valdez School of Social Work, is sponsoring Dr. Gonzalez's presentation. I'm Cristina Duran. I'm the Dean of the Facundo Valdez School of Social Work. So welcome everyone. I'm happy that Dr. Gonzalez was able to join us and that we could sponsor his talk. Dr. Gonzalez is Professor Emeritus at UNM, Department of Sociology. His research interests include race and ethnicity, social movements, political sociology, Latino studies. His recent book, he's author of a recent book, Política, Nuevo Mexicanos and American Political Incorporation, 1821 to 1910. I asked him to present on Oñate, given the timeliness of that topic and everything that's happening around us. So thank you, Dr. Gonzalez.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very honored to be able to participate in Highlands' homecoming. Since I spent my entire career at UNM, I thought I would mention that I do have a personal connection to Highlands, which is that I have a grandson who just started his first year in college at Highlands. So I'm very proud of Jacob Gonzalez, for starting college and doing it at Highlands. I don't mind also mentioning that I have family roots in San Miguel County, so that my dad was born and raised in Sena, which is a little village down on the Pecos River, just north of Villanueva on the San Miguel Delgado Grant. So anyway, I think that gives me an indirect affiliation with Highlands as well. So I was invited to speak on what is currently the very hot topic of the Oñate controversy, and I'm happy to do so. For one thing, because I've been studying the Spanish heritage in New Mexico for practically my entire career, dating to my days as a graduate student at UC Berkeley, which now feels like it was about 100 years ago. So I'm going to try to share my screen here. I'm not sure if I'll be able to or not. I certainly hope so, because I'm very much going to depend on it. But so yes, there it is. And so here is the title of my talk, Remembering Oñate, Strategies in Symbolic Combat. So I definitely will be talking about symbolic combat. Whether or not I'll be able to get to the question of strategies is another question. But so let's get our marbles straight here about who we're talking about. So this is Don Juan de Oñate. This is the equestrian statue of Don Juan de Oñate. You may be familiar with it. It used to stand at the Oñate Resource and Visitor Center in Alcalde, New Mexico, just north of Española, and I'll have occasion to return to this work. And here is Oñate. In the artwork called La Jornada, or The Journey, which is set up at the Statuary Garden at the Albuquerque Museum in Old Town Albuquerque. So fast forward now, let's see, that one was set up in 2005, and I should mention that the one at Alcalde was set up in 1994. So let's fast forward to June 15th of this year and what happened in Albuquerque on that day. And what happened was that an angry crowd tried to take down the Oñate figure from the Albuquerque Museum, La Jornada. There's a press photo of protesters trying to put a chain around Oñate himself in an effort to bring him down. This event turned into a major disturbance, as you probably are aware, with some violence, and so two contending sides, one trying to take down the statue, another trying to defend it, including an external kind of group, the New Mexico militia, I think it's called, and with one individual even getting shot. That's a little bit secondary to our interests here. Basically, what happened is that the protesters did not succeed in bringing down the statue. And what happened is that the Mayor Tim Keller, decided to remove Oñate himself from the site and to put it away for safekeeping for an indeterminate amount of time. So that is what it now looks like. Oñate would have been right there in front of one of his armed guard there. It's a little bit ironic that if you go up to it, you'll see that this figure here is a little bit ahead of this figure here, and he is a native indigenous who came up with the Oñate expedition. So it's a little bit ironic that he would be actually leading the jornada, or the journey up the Rio Grande. In addition, what had been happening is that there was a petition that was sent to the county commissioners of Rio Arriba County, asking that the equestrian Oñate be taken down. When the county commission discovered that there was going to be a protest in a few days, they discussed the idea of removing that particular statue, and in fact, that is what they did. And here is a photo of the equestrian Oñate being taken away. What happens then is that Native American and allied groups then hold a protest and dance rallies around the vacant site where the equestrian Oñate statue was standing. So it might be a good idea to refresh the narrative of what's going on here and why it is that there are these protests against Oñate, what the grievances were. So in the 16th century, the area known as the Southwest today was being discovered and visited by Spanish explorers. And then in 1598, Juan de Oñate was given the right by the Spanish crown to trek up the Rio Bravo, which became the Rio Grande River, with a host of settlers in order to establish the dominion that came to be named La Provincia de la Nuevo Mexico, for the Kingdom of Spain. So that is Oñate's key historical association, the fact that he was the one to actually carve out this whole geopolitical entity that has been called New Mexico ever since. Now, what happened is that Oñate's settlement process in New Mexico was a peaceful one. However, following practice during the conquest of the Americas by Spain, what he does is that he establishes an encomienda economy, which was essentially a system of forced labor, subjecting the pueblos to coercion and violence in order to get them to work the fields and ranches to serve the Spanish settlement communities. Second, all Spanish colonization projects in the Americas involved missionary work, that of converting the indigenous into to Christianity and specifically Catholicism. So there was that. This whole process could be undertaken in different ways. In the case of the establishment of Christianity in the encomienda system, they were not very well received by the pueblos. And so what happens is that there was resistance to this cultural imperialism and this economic imperialism on the part of several of the pueblos, including that of Acoma. And so Oñate then orders a number of military control expeditions, including one at Acoma, which resulted in Oñate's policy of ordering that the right foot of all young men of Acoma be cut off. And so this is an extremely important symbolic gesture that would live in the memory of pueblos and other Native Americans with respect to the Oñate legacy. Now, the assaults, the political assaults on Oñate have been going on for quite a while. And the last major one occurred during the Cuarto Centenario between 1998 and 2005. There had also been the protests against Don Diego de Vargas at the Santa Fe Fiestas, which is still an ongoing dialogue, and had some news actually quite recently, when the Caballeros de Vargas had, I believe they issued a letter of apology for the violence that the Vargas had enacted in order to try to retake control, Spanish control of Santa Fe after the Pueblo revolt of 1680, in which all Spanish settlers were either killed or banished off to the El Paso area. So it's been a long struggle, and it's been a long contention, and it's then essentially from the initial attacks on Columbus by the Red Power movement, which began in the 1990s. Now, here is the unfortunate, really unfortunate, some people might say sad and tragic aspect of the assault on conquistador figures and the particular ones that we're mentioning here. And it is that it has involved an extremely contentious, discursive battle between two groups that have actually experienced social, economic, and cultural disadvantage under American rule. One, of course, was the Native Americans, mostly Pueblo, in this particular case of Oñate and de Vargas, but also non-Pueblo communities and tribes on one hand. And on the other, the social category that us academics like to call the Nuevo Mexicanos, that is the Hispanics whose identity is based on tracing their family genealogies in New Mexico back to Spanish colonial times, and who consider themselves and their fellow Nuevo Mexicanos to comprise a distinct people unto themselves. So that has been at the core of the dynamics in the anti-conquistador movement. And so here is a a press depiction of that. So here, here we have, this was following the removal of the equestrian Oñate in Alcalde. And on the left, you have a young protester from Okai Owenge, who was part of a group that had been dancing on the site. And the newspaper story names the three figures who are from Española and Alcalde, confronting this young man who is representing the assault on the Oñate image and iconography. Now, this dispute that has been going on for many years involves a whole question of the survival of the two groups, and that is the way that it is seen by activists on both sides, or of those who are concerned with the issue on both sides. So that, for example, Pueblo artist Luis Peña has been quoted to say with regard to the Oñate offensive, quote, "It's very difficult for communities to move forward to address the violence against us in American society, that is, when the symbols of historic violence are still allowed to exist." And on the other side, there was someone who wrote into the Albuquerque Journal Speak Up column and said, "I'm Hispanic and I'm getting very tired of our history being destroyed instead of talked about and changed." So this is a reflection of what I mean by symbolic combat. And the contention is extremely bitter. It's extremely intense, and it's very emotional. The protests that took place between 1998 and 2005 on the occasion of the 400th anniversary of the founding in New Mexico by Oñate reflected this very, very keenly, and I was a witness to much of that, and I wrote an article on it. But it is still very much with us today, or it has started up in a new phase in which this attention is being placed on Oñate. So that there was another quote from a Nuevo Mexicano who said, so if you go to the comments section of the online stories, particularly of the Alcalde removal, in the Sun Times and in the New Mexican, then you get a sense of the intense emotions that are involved in this fight. And that is now the forum where the fight is being conducted, as opposed to the chambers of the city council, as it happened back in 1998, 2005 in Albuquerque. Nevertheless, people are expressing themselves in very, very intense ways. One Nuevo Mexicano, and what's very interesting here also is that there had been the suggestion that the identity of being Spanish and Spanish American was starting to dwindle or to wane. And some people felt like it was diminishing. Well, if that's true, then one of the things that is happening is now coming back to the fore. So that there's, I found one quote by a Nuevo Mexicano that said, "I am a Spaniard. My ancestors came from Valverde de Llerena, Extremadura, Spain, along with Oñate. The false narrative being spread by some in the Native American community is offensive to me." And just to drive this point home, this ethnic nomenclature of Spanish Americanism at one time was extremely strong and prevalent in New Mexico. The history of how that came to be is a fascinating tale, and it is one of the things that I am currently examining in a book that I'm working on. We can talk a little bit about that later on, if you like, in the Q&A period. So when I documented and wrote about the Cuarto Centenario episode, I called my chapter "History Hits the Heart," quoting actually quoting a priest who was commenting on the contentious dynamic involved around the Oñate controversy in those days. So one of the things that's extremely interesting about the contention is how it is that both sides have interpretations of history that they marshal for their own side. And so you have historical rationales for one side making an argument that Oñate was the Hitler of New Mexico, versus the other side, which makes which likes to say that Oñate was the George Washington of New Mexico. So the pro-Oñate side says, if it hadn't been for Oñate, we wouldn't even have had New Mexico. New Mexico would not have existed. And of course, the Native American side says, well, if there had not been Oñate, then maybe we would have been able to retain our lands. The pro Oñate side will make the argument that Oñate and the Spanish brought seeds for certain crops that Native Americans use today. They brought horses, which were adopted wholeheartedly by Native Americans. They brought the wheel, and they brought carts, which became part of Native American culture. And a Native Pueblo argument would argue that those were not worth it. We lost our sovereignty. We lost control of this area that rightfully belonged to us. Now, I would make the argument that that's an extremely strong position on the part of Native Americans, logically speaking. The idea that they were on the land first, and that Europeans and Western civilization, embodied especially in Columbus and the Spanish conquistadores, were the ones to have dispossessed them from the land and from their sense of sovereignty. Just to give you, I have a number of quotes here. When on the use of history on the part of no Mexicanos. One which was made quite a bit actually in the during the Cuarto Centenario, and one that is coming back to the fore is something like this. Oñate statues in Alcalde, Albuquerque, and everywhere else in New Mexico need to remain standing, and Spanish New Mexicans need to stand up to this bullying by some in the Native American community. Our Spanish heritage needs to be preserved. If not, all the sacrifices and suffering of our Spanish ancestors went through will be destroyed and forgotten. All right, so you get the picture. I have lots of examples of this. The main point being this really, really unfortunate situation. We have these two groupings who claim nativity and long-standing residence and commitment to New Mexico, going at it, going at each other's throats in very sharp and recriminatory ways. And it is something that has been going on for quite a while. So what is interesting is how the Cuarto Centenario episode was resolved. Because this was something, this was an issue that was being brought before the city council, before the statuary actually went up, before the portrayal of Oñate and La Jornada was actually installed. When the city commission was considering the proposal for a bust of Oñate, that's what the dispute was before the city council. And it was before the city council that these pro and anti arguments were being put forth, which meant that there had to be some kind of resolution. City council had to vote either yes or no on an Oñate representation and how that would happen. And what happened is that it was almost like a UN legal fight between nations, so that each side had their own nonprofit organizations that were representing their side and that were trying to negotiate an agreement between both sides. And they had these meetings that were actually summit meetings between representatives of both sides. So what happened was that a resolution, a set of compromises, might even call it a treaty, was negotiated by representatives of the two sides. And there were three elements to this resolution. Two of them involved concessions by the Spanish Americans. The first one was that Oñate would not be portrayed riding a conquering steed. Rather, he would be portrayed on foot. And so, and you can see the depiction of that here. He's actually walking, and that document that he's got in his hand is the charter that was granted to him to establish la provincia of New Mexico. So there was that. So you can contrast that with the image of the equestrian Oñate in Oñate. I should mention that it was the same artist who portrayed these two Oñates. Reynaldo Sani Rivera was the artist of both the equestrian Oñate, and he was the one that was commissioned to do Oñate for La Jornada, him and actually Betty Sable collaborated in the larger Jornada artwork. The second adjustment that was agreed upon was that the overall statuary would remove the emphasis or the stress on Oñate himself and be placed on the pobladores. That is the larger group of, I don't know what it was, 300 or so settlers that had come with Oñate in order to establish communities in New Mexico. And you can see some portrayal of that here. So you have women with children, and you have a priest, and you have the oxen. That's a big carreta in the back. And I tried to look for a picture of these men who were pushing the carreta. And so this was supposed to represent then not the heroics of a conquistador, but rather the common folk of the period and of the settlement process, representing the ancestors of the people who live in the communities of northern New Mexico today. So it was meant as an homage and a tribute to them. Finally, the third change was that the pueblos would also have their own artwork put up along with La Jornada, and that artwork was created by Nora Luján Moores, who I think is Santo Domingo. I'm not recalling right now. And she created a natural landscape artwork called Numbe Waguer. And it was supposed to represent the nature and what the area looked like without human contact, but it also represented a spiritual core, a spiritual center for with regard not only to the earth but also to humankind. And so that was that's what it looks like from a side view. And here is a architect's rendition of it. So you can see how it's got a whirl. If you've been there, then you know there's this centerpiece right here where people can walk down here and come down to it. Okay, so in terms of a social dispute and contention, this was an actual resolution. This was a coming together of both sides who had just been engaged in a very rough fight, very bitter. Tears shed on both sides. That's how important history is for for people in general, and for these particular actors in the Oñate dispute. So, you would think then that there would be possibilities for this kind of accommodation to occur once again, and to be able to come to terms on how to represent the history of New Mexico, the founding in New Mexico, and the long pre-American legacies of people in the state of New Mexico. The irony, of course, is that this is what was agreed to, and it was the same Oñate figure that was decided upon that was the object of attack in this most recent episode of objection to conquistadores. It's not difficult to understand that because what we have now is a new generation of protesters who are now continuing the tradition of erasing, deleting, or canceling the images of their historical oppressors. And a new tradition of no Mexicanos who continue to defend what they consider their own heritage. So, the prospects of some kind of resolution and mutual agreement for how to portray New Mexico history then looks very much in doubt. And it is occurring at a time when American society itself is becoming so heavily fractured. So the future does not look all that, all that positive for the possibilities of folks coming together. There is no forum that that equates to the decision-making process involved in the city council. So that's that's basically my presentation. We can talk a little bit more about the history of these identity formations, if we'd like. Here there are resources. My History Hits the Heart chapter came out in this book that I edited called Expressing New Mexico. There are other. There's another chapter on Oñate by Kathy Fries, which assesses the meaning of the La Jornada. There are other articles of Michael Trujillo's Oñate's Foot, Remembering and Dismembering in Northern New Mexico, Allison Fields, New Mexico Cuarto Centenario, a visual dialogue. So if you want these resources, then just get a hold of me, and I can send you a bibliography on it. And so you can bet there's going to be more analysis, more academic treatments of this most recent phase on the Oñate no Mexicano contention. So let us see what they come up with. So that's my presentation, and I think that we can be ready for questions. If you
yes, this is Bill Garcia, and I have a comment and I think it's a question. Thank you for your presentation. I think you have articulated that there is anger, genuine anger and emotion on two sides of an issue with Oñate. But it's not just Oñate. I live here in Santa Fe, and we recently had Don Diego de Vargas' statue removed from the downtown area. The obelisk, which was established over 100 years ago, was forcibly, illegally, and unlawfully destroyed. Other symbols, as you say, symbolic art is being challenged and questioned here. And you said we haven't devised a way yet to get to balancing all of the interests. I think the mayor of Santa Fe here is going to convene a Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Okay.
Because I think that it's needed. I was deeply offended at the action taken on the plaza by people who acted unlawfully and in a destructive manner. Because in my view, it was attacking my history, my roots, my ancestors, and all the culture that I'm associated with.
Mm-hmm.
And but I don't know all of the facts. For example, in 1680, Pompey, whose statue is now in Statuary Hall in Congress,
Yes.
led the revolt, which in essence was a clandestine ambush that resulted in the deaths of over 400 settlers, men, women, and children.
Yes.
Over, I think, 200 or 300 priests were ambushed and pulled out and massacred and killed. The churches were burned.
Yes.
So in many, if you viewed that in the context of today's history, people could call that terrorism, and I think rightfully so. And the fact that it was clandestine and it was an ambush, it drove the Spanish settlers, the civilians, if you will, out of the area. So when they returned a decade or so later, Diego de Vargas approached Santa Fe and in fact did reclaim the territory, did reclaim the city, the area, and the settlers moved back in. It was bloodless at that point in time.
That point I will dispute. It wasn't, but
okay, that's why
but go ahead and finish.
People do dispute that, but what I have read was that later on, after they settled back in, there was animosity that was broiling and roiling, and that resulted in another uprising, which was put down physically and with great force. So yeah, there was bloodshed at that point in time, but it was only in reaction to the again another ambush, if you will, to push the settlers out. So I think we need a lot of facts here, and there are allegations on both sides. Everything's got to be judged in the history in the terms of context. And so I would hope that we could get a truth and reconciliation, because I don't want to see a decision made just because I'm angry. But the fact of the matter is, it really did anger me that that symbol was pulled down arbitrarily, without trial, if you will, without trial. And so I do think a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is a good idea, because then you could, in effect, provide the history from many different sources and perspectives. Thank you.
Yes, let me respond. First of all, on the obelisk. So that was a tribute to the soldiers who it was a twin tribute. One was to those No Mexicano, those New Mexicans of all races and cultures who served in the Civil War and who were killed during the Civil War. The other part of it was also a tribute to those non-Indians who had fallen in the Indian Mexican wars. Now here was the problem with the wording on that part of it, which was the use of the word savage. Now, if you go back over time, as I have done, the use of the word savage by non-Indians was common parlance. It was part and parcel of how Native Americans were basically excluded from the Western governmental apparatuses and the societies that were being set up. So at the time, it was even commonsensical, and it occurred at a time when there was no capacity for resistance to that kind of language. So here is what's very significant here is how it is that human beings react not only to threats to their material welfare or to their lives, but to their sense of what constitutes reality, the symbolic part of of our existence. And so the anger that surfaces, because they did the same thing on the Mormon, the Mormon tribute on Highway 25 down before Buttigieg's. That one also had the word. I visited that once, and someone actually chiseled out the word savage. Now, perhaps you're right. Maybe a Truth and Reconciliation a process could have dealt with that particular issue and could have done away with the word savage, and that may have resolved it. But it would not have resolved the greater sense of oppression that the entire history of European empire and taking over of lands, the genocide that we know was real for much of this process in both North America and South America. So it may have taken care of that particular issue, but not have stemmed the greater sense of conflict going on. The pro-Oñate, one major argument in the pro-Oñate side had to do with the Pueblo revolt and the fact that there were these civilians, common families, men and women and children, who were killed in the revolt. Now, here's the thing, is that what would it have taken in order to cast off what was considered as a very oppressive regime? The alternative would have been to capture the soldiery of Oñate. And I don't know, Oñate himself. But it seems to me, and here I want to emphasize that I'm trying to be, as totally, I don't want to say neutral or objective, but I do want to understand the dynamics of the conflict.
Yeah,
I just don't think.
A quick reaction. The Spanish were the ones that actually installed the Pueblo Authority, and they sanctioned the Pueblo governors, and in fact presented them with the staff of authority, I believe, that they have cherished for many, many years. They
and
also,
Pueblo boundaries too.
Pardon?
And Pueblo boundaries.
Yeah, and so there were very many positive contributions. When we say that the Spanish oppressed, that implies a prevailing oppression. I don't think that was the case. There were instances, but also they protected them from the nomadic tribes who were raiders, the Apaches, the Comanches,
Yes.
Navajo.
Okay.
So the Pueblos benefited greatly from Spanish support.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Could we get some other questions? Eric Romero has a question. Robin Barti is after Eric. Dr. Romero?
Doctor, gracias. Thank you very much for a clarifying presentation. Hope you're doing well. I just kind of have a double level question in the sense that in academia, and you remember, we have our program here at Highlands is Native American Hispano Cultural Studies.
That's good. That's interesting.
There. And as academicians, we work a lot, significantly with the concept of mestizaje, right?
Yeah.
And looking at that intersectionality, that cultural and biological mixing between cultures. And I'm wondering to what degree that the academic discussion regarding that, even to include if we're looking at biological genealogical analysis, which identifies that so many of our northern New Mexico Hispanic population has a significant amount of Native American bloodlines, including Tlaxcala, Azteca, Nahuatl, Tiwa, Tanoan.
Yes.
And so no matter how could we inform more this discussion to recognize that it's not as polarized as it seems to be, but there's a lot of in between.
Yes, and including tons of social relations between non-Mexicano communities and Pueblos, and intermarriage, And that occurs today and has been occurring all along. And Miguel Encinas used to point this out during the Cuarto Centenario debate. And so you do have those social realities. Here's the thing, is that what we're talking about is a discourse that happens on a particular platform, basically out in civil society. And what takes place on that level then is not always resolvable by looking at essential realities on the ground. And let's even take the concept of mestizaje. Now, old classic Spanish identity argued that there was never any social relations between the Spanish colonizers and the indigenous peoples, that there was blood purity. And this was one line of Spanish American identity that continued for quite a while. However, you do have some who identify as Spanish American who acknowledge that they come from a mixed blood heritage in their own families, and yet they will continue to identify as Spanish and Spanish American because they rely on a cultural explanation. And they will argue that, it is the core Spanish institutions that were brought over in the colonizing process that are really the foundation for our particular heritage. So the rationales and the logics that occur when people are projecting their interpretations of history and identity in public are quite different than what happens when people are interacting on a social level in their everyday lives. And so it isn't always, a situation in which people will say, "Oh yeah, you're right, absolutely," and then they'll change, their particular line. It just doesn't happen that way because there are resources that are being contended for. There's competition that's going on. The identity of New Mexico is a resource. It's a symbolic resource, and people are competing over what that identity should look like.
Thank you. Professor Barti, you had a question, and then Gabriel Melendez.
Hey, I want to make sure that I heard you correctly when you said that one of Oñate's sort of signature moves was to cut off the right foot of male indigenous people. Is that correct?
Yeah, it wasn't a common practice. It is what he ordered in the case of Acoma, in the resistance that was being put up by the people of Acoma.
Okay, so essentially, that really struck me because there was no anesthesia, no antibiotics or anything. That's essentially a potential death sentence to someone, a very long way around, excruciating, and then they would no longer be allowed to hunt or work, or there was
and rebel.
Function.
And rebel. That was a very important reason for it.
Yeah.
So it turns out that Oñate was tried and convicted for these kinds of atrocities while he was governor of New Mexico. And so that's a major argument that's also put up by the anti-Oñate side. And so it is recognized even by the Spanish crown and authorities that there were aspects of his rule that were, not humanitarian and went against the principles of de las Casas, who put forth the norms that the natives should be treated humanely.
Dr. Melendez. You're muted, Dr. Melendez.
So thank you very much, Felipe Gonzalez, colleague and friend. And really your work in terms of New Mexico history, particularly the 19th century, is very, very, very instructive. It's hard to talk about this topic without getting involved in the sort of discursive nature of its polemics. And I think part of it has to do with this fact of we're kind of viewing history as kind of a postage stamp history or a snapshot history, right? By focusing in on these iconic figures like Oñate. And I think that's a problem. So before you get to a truth and reconciliation venue, people have to study the history. They have to go into depth, and they have to understand that you can't isolate one event in history and then bring it forth 450 years later and expect it to have the same value that it had 450 years ago. That's just impossible. So it gets us into this place of, because when you use this notion of symbolic representation, and you pit two groups up against each other, right? Pueblos, in this case, Pueblos and Nuevo Mexicanos, or whoever the descendants of the Spanish mestizos are, it just seems like it misses about 400 years of history. So I would like to replace that conflictual idea with an idea more like convivencia. So thinking about the process of history that happened since 1680, since the Pueblo Revolt up until the present, because there's been and for those of you who don't speak Spanish, convivencia means a kind of living together, a kind of living arrangement in which people move on to take care of the day-to-day in order to survive. And that's happened on both sides of the issue. So I don't know, maybe I guess that's a question. What do you think about convivencia in the history of New Mexico? Where has that appeared?
Yeah, but I mean, this is similar to a previous one. I think I agree with you that in order to come with some sort of conciliation, that maybe the thing to do is not to refer to specific historical events of the past, but to come to some sense of peace and a way of moving forward, and basically truth and reconciliation is a process of convivencia, and in the sense of at least settling terms and returning or going to a time when people will accept the other. It's kind of a formal convivencia, if we want to call it that. It could be that concept could very well be put on a truth and reconciliation table. The concept could be worked and reworked and developed and perhaps be used as one term that could establish some kind of some kind of sense of putting down the verbal arms against the other. So I think that there might be some possibility in that.